In September of 1942, a Japanese ship called the Lisbon Maru set sail from Hong Kong to Japan, carrying 1,816 British prisoners of war, sent to Japan to work in the dockyards there, and the factories and the mines, to free up Japanese men to join the Japanese armed forces. But that ship never arrived. Hundreds of those men were killed in its sinking. Now, I knew nothing about that story when I first arrived in Hong Kong, but I was interested in history, and I started writing a book about the fighting between the Japanese and the British Commonwealth soldiers in December of 1941. And while researching that book, I spoke to many veterans and their families, many survivors of these events, and they told me about the Lisbon Maru and the loss of the lives of hundreds of their friends. And I started getting interested. That first book was all about the fighting between the garrison and the Japanese, and it ended with the surrender of Hong Kong and the Japanese taking thousands of those men prisoner and putting them in prisoner of war camps, where their existence was very precarious. They had very little food. They suffered and died from malnutrition and disease and poor treatment. In early September of 1942, the Japanese saw the opportunity to take some of these men to Japan as slave labour. That first ship got through safely, carrying 616 British prisoners. And then the Japanese ordered a bigger ship into Hong Kong harbour, and that ship was the Lisbon Maru. Now, many of those prisoners of war thought this might be an opportunity. The prisoner of war camps were so bad, the death rate was so high. Perhaps this ship would be their salvation. So they started boarding at the end of September 1942. In the end, 1,850 or so got on board, and they came from all parts of the British forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and so forth. And they boarded one by one, but many of them brought diseases on board, and some of them had to be taken off the ship and taken back to camp. And so it was that when the ship finally sailed, it carried 1,816 men. The first day or two on the ship went fine. They had cigarettes, they had food, they had water. They were allowed on deck to wash, and they felt reasonably comfortable. What they didn't know, though, was that the American Navy was looking specifically for ships like this, hugging the Chinese coastline, going up towards Shanghai, before cutting across, taking the shortest route over deep water to Moji and Japan itself. One submarine, the USS Grouper number 214, and its crew were waiting for vessels like this, and they put a torpedo through the side of Lisbon Maru. And the Japanese watched the vessel sink. In the vessel, trapped inside the holds, with the hold hatches battened down so they could not escape, were these 1,816 men. When the ship sank, the men were desperate. They broke out anyway. They got out and into the water. Some of them managed to swim to some local islands. Others found themselves saved by Chinese fishermen who, under fire of the Japanese, sailed into the area in small boats and started picking men out of the water one by one, and then in the tens, and then in the hundreds. And all those survivors were taken by the Chinese fishermen to their islands and were fed and clothed to the best of those people's ability. And there, as far as the British were concerned, the story ended. There is very little communication during World War II between the British and the Japanese. Some British families got messages back saying, "Your son has been lost at sea." Others heard nothing at all until even after the war. There were families I spoke to decades later who had no idea what had happened to the husband, the father, the son, and they had no news at all until I was able to do some research. So I started writing a book about the sinking of the Lisbon Maru, and that involved talking to many of the veterans. My wife and I flew up to Jiaoshan in 2005, interviewed the fishermen to get their story, and with that combination of the fisherman's story, I managed to find the last survivor from the American submarine. I spoke to maybe 10 or more survivors of Lisbon Maru and perhaps 100 families of men who'd been through that terrible experience. And collecting all this information, the letters, the diaries, the photographs, the stories, I wrote a book. And that book was published, The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru, back in 2006. And there things pretty much stopped. But the people of Jiaoshan, they remembered the story. and they had an annual commemoration of the event, which they started at that time. And also a small group of people in the UK got together and they created and built a memorial in the National Memorial Arboretum in the UK, commemorating again the sinking of the Lisbon Maru. And then we started hearing stories about a Chinese-based film producer called Fang, who apparently wanted to create a documentary about this whole event. Initially, I didn't take it too seriously, but then one day I saw in the newspapers in the UK some very big and probably very expensive advertisements about the Lisbon Maru, trying to find relatives of those on board so that they could be interviewed by Fang and his team. And then I started working with the team and found they were very serious, and I started to have hope that a film would really be created. Fang and the guys, they filmed in Jiaoshan. They interviewed the last surviving fishermen who helped rescue POWs. They interviewed the families of those who saved the POWs and fed them in the islands and hid them as well. The team went to the UK and filmed interviews with 100 or more families of men who had been aboard that ship. And these interviews were extremely emotional and powerful. And they included interviews with the last surviving veteran of the Lisbon Maru alive in the UK at that time, Dennis Morley. The team then flew to Canada and spoke to Bill Benningfield, the other survivor, of the only two survivors at the time when the film was made. And they filmed in the US, where they spoke to the families of the torpedo man and the captain of the USS Grouper, the American submarine which launched the torpedo which sank the ship. They even went to Japan and tracked down the family of the captain of the Lisbon Maru, and they came to Hong Kong to film here too and to interview me. As a result of all that work, and it was hard work and no doubt expensive work, and it was interrupted by problems ranging from the pandemic to trying to find funding for the movie, but after years of work, finally a prototype film was ready to be shown in a private screening to an audience of family members of those men who had been on board the ship. And those family members were able to give their critique to the film and give their suggestions and suggest changes. And the final film, with those refinements and changes and additions, was released in its global premiere at the Shanghai International Film Festival in June of 2024. It was an amazing experience, a whole theatre full of people who knew nothing about the Lisbon Maru, had no emotional connection to it whatsoever, and were all in tears by the time the film ended. And then, on September the 1st of 2024, the film had its premiere in Beijing before being released to the public in China, starting on September the 6th of that year. And within just over a month, 1 million people had seen it. The ratings were sky high. The word of mouth was fantastic. It had a reception beyond anything I would have ever expected. And then, to cap all that,